It's Wednesday, October 16th, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, you get to choose MSU's next leaders. Yes, that's true. Look at the bottom of your ballot this November, and you'll see a slate of candidates for MSU's Board of Trustees. So, on today's episode, we're going to tell you everything you need to know about these board hopefuls, and that way you can make an informed choice. So here to help me do that are two very bright minds from here at the State News. It's our admin reporters, Theo Shear and Owen McCarthy. Theo, Owen, thank you guys for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks, Alex.
Thanks for having us.
It's always a pleasure for me and an honor for you guys, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You guys have spent the last week or so talking to these candidates for this MSU Board of Trustees. You've interviewed all of them. You've written profiles about all of them. You guys know this race probably better than anybody. And you're going to tell the listeners at home, what they need to know so they can get into that ballot booth or mail at home ballot, popular, and make a good choice. But first of all, before we get into that, for people who might be understandably confused, why do we get to pick these people? Why is everybody in Michigan voting on the university's board? Isn't that weird? Theo, tell us about it.
I mean, it's a little weird. MSU is one of 3 public universities in Michigan that has it like this. Typically, boards are just elected by the governor.
Yeah.
But here, they're decided by a statewide race.
I mean, nationally, it's bizarre, right? I mean, I think
is.
the vast majority of states, we're one of very few that lets voters decide this.
Absolutely, yeah. It's MSU, Wayne State, and U of M.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The land grants. And it's part of the state constitution, right? So it would be tricky to undo, although there has been talk of that in recent years. Well, tell us, since voters are entrusted with this odd but very important choice for the university, first of all, is this a partisan race? Should people be thinking, I'm going down my ballot, Democrats, Republicans? Oh, and tell me, are people just voting down Democrats or Republicans, or is it weird?
One absolutely could kind of take the straight party line vote, but, what I can tell you is that even in talking, to one candidate, they sort of said it's a little bit odd. It's the hand we're dealt. It's the system we have where it's partisan. But a lot of these issues we're dealing with sort of seem to transcend these partisan divides here. There's some areas where you see sort of signaling because it is partisan in the sense that the parties in Michigan do pick these people, right? So you see sort of signaling in different areas. For example, there's one candidate on the Democratic side who their campaign website, talks about fair wages, some sort of like labor rights adjacent issues, which you would typically associate with people who are sort of fiscally liberal. And then on the conservative side, there's a candidate who talks about, keeping transgender women out of women's sports, which is, again, one of these very, partisan kind of issues. To answer your question, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't partisan.
I mean, they have to get the nominations of the major parties. So to some extent, it seems like they have to signal like certain loyalties to those issues. But the actual issues they'll consider as board members, I think, are more complicated than like a straight left-right thing.
Yeah, I agree.
That's why we have these great voter guides so people can learn about where they stand on the various issues.
That's right.
So tell me, let's start with you, Theo, because you interviewed the one semi-familiar face, I guess, in this race. Tell me about Republican candidate Mike Balow.
Yeah, Mike Balow, you might find him familiar a little bit. He ran before in 2022, very narrowly lost, I think just by 8,000 votes or so. I think it's one of the closest races in the state. He is a former Marine vet. He has gone to, he says, every board meeting in the last 4 years, and I can attest to at least the last year and a half. I've seen him there.
2.5 years I've seen him at every one.
Okay, yeah. So we've got, and he is running basically to promote transparency, kind of stabilize the board. He wants to be a stabilizing figure on the Board of Trustees and make kind of concerted effort to engage community members a little bit more, kind of reach out to them, break what he calls the green wall of silence, where it's, trustees feel like they can't really speak publicly or about something, about mistakes or issues. So.
And you have to talk about, with Mike Balow, he kind of came into this MSU orbit with the whole swim and dive thing. His daughter was, an athlete on the swim and dive team here at MSU. In 2020, when they cut the team, he was a part of a very vocal group of advocates trying to get the team back. I have not heard much from them recently. I have heard a lot less from him about that recently. The swim and dive thing seems to kind of have not blown over, but
Yeah.
simmered down as kind of hopes have been dashed for any sort of resolution.
It's simmered. It's
but-
still part of his platform,
Yes.
absolutely, yeah.
But he seems to have stuck around and outlived the whole swim and dive advocacy thing, and now is just a general, very involved MSU figure.
Absolutely.
But of course,
yeah.
that's kind of where he comes from, is this swim and dive world.
Right, yeah.
Oh, and also on the Republican ticket,
Mm-hmm.
Julie Madej. Tell me about her, another candidate.
Yeah, Julie Madej is someone who's really coming at this race, I would say, from the perspective of a parent. She, and that's very much so in line with kind of the role she played in her community of Novi ever since, the early 2000s when, her kids were born. She told me about, all the different committees and boards she sat on in Novi community schools. And sort of that catapulted her to a point where she got on the planning commission there, and then she was actually appointed to the city council for a little bit. And so she was just a very sort of involved community figure in Novi, who was always kind of one of these parent advocates. And so when her son comes to MSU from 2019 to 2023, she was, again, paying attention to the education that her son was getting. And she told me about feeling like there were all these decisions by MSU's administration that were sort of these blanket decisions where the exact impacts on a student's mental health wasn't really being considered, and that the board was sort of just rubber stamping those things. And swim and dive is an example, actually. She said she has children who are athletes, and she can't imagine if they went to school thinking they were going to do this and it meant so much to them, and then all of a sudden it was just sort of cut out of nowhere. So that's kind of where she's coming at this race.
Mm-hmm. And what about, she talks in her platform about her son. And if you remember, her son, Blake Madej, actually was kind of an outspoken student when he was here. I remember he talked a lot about the issue with Sanjay Gupta's removal in the Broad College. He was a Broad student and was very outspoken at board meetings. Tell me about the story she told you about why she decided to run with her son and the vaccine mandate and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, the Sanjay Gupta saga, her son was very vocal during that time period, and he believed that his dean was wrongfully terminated. And Julie Madej is on the same page. She told me she thinks that's an example of, quote, cancel culture. And she tells me if someone
Sanjay Gupta was canceled, is her kind of.
Yes.
Yeah.
She said it was a procedural thing. He had no malice, and I don't know how much we kind of want to get into the whole saga, but the short version of it is that Sanjay Gupta was terminated for not reporting sexual misconduct. Sort of the caveat there of a subordinate of his, sort of the caveat is that he was under the impression that other people were going to be reporting that sexual misconduct.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask Teresa Woodruff, who, asked him to resign, or those who are supportive of her, I think they would say that, she actually articulated this pretty clearly in a letter that she wrote to the board, that, he's a dean. MSU has a very troubled history of sexual misconduct. Any sort of shortfall there is unacceptable.
Right.
And so he could not be a dean anymore. If you ask him about it, he'll say that it's part of a broad conspiracy to eliminate him as a presidential contender.
Right.
That, Woodruff, it was some sort of power play.
Yeah.
I think a lot of his supporters, including I think Blake Madej at certain board meetings, would agree with that framing, that it was an unfair firing. But anyway, we don't have to get too into that.
Yeah. I mean, Julie Madej, I'll tell you, she didn't get into that aspect of it, if there was some ulterior motive there and it had to do with the presidential succession thing. But she did see as an example of, cancel culture, where someone, didn't do something that was actually causing harm, and yet they're facing these consequences because of this, overly sensitive, almost woke culture. Not that she said that, but, cancel culture was the phrase there.
That's her framing, I guess. That's a cancel culture thing. But tell me about, I'm asking about the thing with her son, where she said this with the Stanley era vaccine mandate that inspired her to run. I thought that was an interesting anecdote.
Yeah, so, she said, and I want to preface this, and she prefaced this as well when she told me, she is not, she says, even though she has an R by her name, she's not anti-vax, she's not anti-mask even, or was not anti-mask during the COVID pandemic. But she tells me that, her son didn't really want to get the vaccine. And then a mandatory vaccine comes out, and he's still on the fence, but he's like, well, I have to do it. If I don't do it, especially with how involved I am on campus, that just would not be smart. Then he gets the vaccine, and then in her telling, he was hospitalized because of his reaction to the vaccine. And that's when she, and again, with these blanket decisions, she saw this as, this decision that's being made without really considering how it might impact students. And for her, it was like a very tangible, almost severe thing where this decision by the administration sort of directly led to my son ending up in the hospital even. And so that's when she was like, I need to make sure I'm a part of leadership here, and I can lead with a much more particular responsiveness to students.
So is her, I guess her platform, her idea for how if she was able to single-handedly operate MSU differently, is it like an anti-regulatory mindset where she wants just sort of less mandates, less, I mean, we talk about blanket decisions. Is her solution to that just sort of like less rules, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a broader trend with this slate of candidates that there's not a ton of really specific policy proposals, and so I can't, my sense in talking to her is not that is her idea, is to sort of deregulate MSU, right? She did single out the vaccine thing, she did single out the Gupta thing and the swim and dive thing, but as far as her thinking that the correct route to go, if she had her way, is to eliminate rules, I don't think that.
She focused more on sort of her woes with MSU than proposed solutions to those.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
I see. Well, let's move over to the Democratic side of the ticket. Theo, you talked to Thomasstalworth. Tell me about him. What has him running?
He is, he's a longtime Detroit lawmaker. He was state representative for a while, and he comes from a family of, similarly, a lot of lawmakers. His mother was a famous, very well known in Detroit, Alma Stallworth, and so is his wife, his daughter, his brother. They're all very involved in the community, or at least were. And yeah, for him, it's interesting. He was a former student back in the 70s. He took his undergraduate classes at MSU, and it is interesting. He was involved at the time in a lot of the demonstrations, protests, sit-ins that were happening at the time to kind of advocate for more resources for Black students. And yeah, he recalled, he told me about being in the administration building, kind of described him and his colleagues as loud, boisterous, combative, but he said that the administration actually really listened, and he supported that. And it's sort of interesting to see him running for trustee, because he would be kind of on the other side of the table there. And I asked him about, we're seeing a lot of campus activism today on par with that of his own. And he told me that he would, try and mimic how he was treated. You listen to these students and appreciate their activism. He did say that.
Did he frame himself, I guess, as more open to that sort of activism as other candidates for the current board members?
He is he's open to the activism part of it. I mean, he supports civil discourse protests, but personally, with matters of divestment, he said he's not convinced that's what's going to change the situation in Gaza.
He doesn't necessarily agree with some of the things that students are currently advocating for, but he believes they have the right should advocate.
So. Yeah, exactly. And he supports this sort of, and we've seen they've disrupted board meetings recently, presidential investiture. So he appreciates that.
Maybe sees a bit of himself.
Right.
Activists.
Yeah. Who knows? I think another big thing he's running on is affordability. He wants to find ways of making MSU more affordable, whether that be advocating for more money from the government, or looking inside MSU to see how we can kind of reduce liability, as he called it. Liability, yeah. I mean, he mentioned the Mel Tucker situation as a good example. There was a lot of litigation that came out of that because, as he put it, because of an employee's mistake. And he says, like, if we establish better policies when, handling employees, then it's less likely to end up in these sorts of situations that end up very, very costly for the university, like Mel Tucker. That was his argument.
Tuition potentially could be brought down by lowering litigation expenses.
Basically, yes. Yeah.
Does he have like a figure as to like how litigation? I mean, because litigation expenses seem like a pretty small part of the overall budget, especially with like the kind of insurance that MSU has. Did he,
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, no, I think it's more of a broader thing about reducing unnecessary costs. But yeah.
But on the other side of that, with like increased revenue, the state appropriation, is that something that he specifically was saying that he might? I mean, he's a former lawmaker. I don't know if he served on the appropriations committee. I mean, that's a longstanding issue for MSU. That's something that he feels is important to him, increasing that appropriation?
He thinks that, MSU can do a better job of campaigning the state government for more money for them, but also just for public universities in general. He thinks it's not just an MSU issue, but just an MSU or an issue across higher ed affordability.
Well, it's something I've heard, kind of both sides of it. There's very much an argument that like the state appropriation should just be cut in a way that MSU gets more of it, because currently its share is kind of disproportionate with the amount of students it's educating. But that's interesting that instead, what if we just increase the share of appropriations going to higher education in general, lift everybody up?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, exactly. I don't think he's concerned specifically with MSU. It's more just, a very general thing.
Well, and then Owen, final of the major party candidates. Tell me about Rebecca Bahar Cook.
Yeah, sort of a decent segue talking about money. Rebecca Bahar Cook has worked in political fundraising. She's made a career out of it, decades. She's currently based in Lansing, and she's the CEO of a firm called Capital Fundraising Associates. They work more with kind of like nonprofit groups, but sort of taking her expertise from raising money for political campaigns, and these are, your Debbie Stabenows, high-profile people here in Michigan, kind of taking her expertise and applying it to these other sectors is kind of the work she's involved in these days. And so she also talked about affordability and spoke to me about, she sees herself as someone who's great at forming these partnerships, and that's been her work the whole time, is figuring out how can we bring more money into this by partnering with people. And so she talked about, is MSU approaching all the foundations that it could in order to sort of bring tuition costs down? She mentioned, looking for foundations that specialize in kind of like DEI efforts to make sure that
lowering tuition with some sort of infusion of like philanthropy money.
Exactly. And again, she wasn't naming names here, but she was saying those are the kind of things she's interested in getting done on the board. And sort of an anecdote I have at the start of my story is when she was an Ingham County commissioner for about 11 years, and I asked her about what were you most proud of there, and she told me about this time when kind of right amid the financial crisis of 07, 08. She is sort of she was delegated to mediate the discussions between the city of Lansing and Ingham County, and this was all about the Potter Park Zoo. And the Potter Park Zoo is about to lose its accreditation, and it wasn't going to be able to have these exotic animals anymore, right? And the city doesn't have the money, right? And so they approach the county, but she tells me the city and county don't trust each other, and she's the one in charge of kind of restoring that trust. She ultimately negotiates this sort of transfer of the zoo from the city to the county, and then gets a ballot measure to fund the zoo that eventually passes, and then it was a great success. And so she said, that sort of partnership building and negotiations is where she specializes, and she thinks it can lead to some more money coming into the university.
Yeah. What about other MSU issues? Did you get a chance to get into anything else?
Yeah. And so, she spoke a lot about this kind of collaboration aspect, right? And she said that that also applies to her perspective about how she sees herself relative to her colleagues on the board. And so, she said that when we think of the trustees Vassar and Dental being referred to the governor, which, by the way, she knows the governor. Governor Whitmer, she campaighed with her actually.
It's sort of an endorsement, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Last week,
she was on campus with Governor Whitmer, talking to students.
Together on campus. But she spoke about feeling like kind of what trustees Vassar and Dental were accused of, and the reason that they're currently, on Whitmer's desk right now. She said that stuff wasn't malfeasant enough for them to be removed, and they were, elected statewide, and it wouldn't be appropriate for them to be removed. So that was one thing she kind of weighed in on there. Although she did say that something that was particularly salient for her was that these trustees had been sort of encouraging students to attack other people in MSU leadership, sort of on the trustees' behalf. She said,
as the students they talked about framed it to you, they felt sort of manipulated.
Right, and Rebecca Bahar Cook said that was not appropriate to her. And then I asked her about divestment. She said she's not open to that. It was a pretty firm answer there. She thinks, she said the university's already looked at it. They've decided it's not the route that they're going, and she's comfortable with that, so she's not going to reopen that discussion. She also, I mentioned earlier, kind of like the signaling when it comes to like labor rights or wages, and that stuff is on her website. She said that, she is supportive of the tenure track faculty who are currently trying to get recognition from the administration. Asked her a little bit about even the graduate employees union that's kind of been trying to amend their contract to bring up these wages, get more sort of healthcare coverage, and she said she's absolutely to sort of continuing conversations there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's interesting how, if you look at the split with the candidates, you have these two Democratic candidates that are very much kind of like Lansing Politico types. I mean, Stallworth is a former state rep. He's talking about lobbying for further appropriations. Bahar Cook is a professional political fundraiser talking about trying to infuse philanthropy money into MSU. And on the Republican side, you have another kind of synergy where they're both MSU parents that are very into like individual student-centered issues that they encountered as parents. I think until this conversation, I didn't realize that kind of alignment there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But tell me, one kind of candidate I'm not hearing anything about is anybody who's been on the board before. There are no incumbents in this race, Theo. Why are there no incumbents?
There are not. So, I mean, Dan Kelly, who's currently the board chair, he was running for re-election.
For the Republican nomination, right?
Yeah, exactly. But he did not get it. Instead, Madej and Belo.
Why was he rejected in favor of Madej and Belo?
Yeah, I mean, there was never an official answer, but I've spoken to some delegates that were there at the convention, as well as other, stakeholders. And they say that it's more of an attempt to kind of clean slate on the board. That I spoke to a Nassar survivor, actually, and she told me that at the start of all of it, when they were starting to sue MSU, that was one of their big demands was clean slate. We want to see fresh faces on the board. And finally, now they are kind of starting to see that. It's all kind of new people. And I think the reason that many people told me they weren't as supportive of Dan Kelly was that he has already been on the board. He was there during some Nassar-related things. I mean, not during.
I mean, there since 2016. There
2016.
For the withholding the docs for years. There for sort of rejecting the outside assessment.
Absolutely, and it's kind of this reputation has spoiled every candidate that's already been there.
And association is just toxic in itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, and then Diane Byram, the other, I guess, would-be incumbent, just didn't run at all.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are two
she's
spots
done with it. Yeah. But that's interesting that just this board, which has been marred in so much controversy for so long, just being on it in itself just sort of absolves you of getting that nomination.
And Dan Kelly even has indicated that, I had a chance to ask him, why do you think you didn't get this nomination? And he said he thought it could be part of it. He didn't say it was the entire reason, but just the fact that he was on the board during the Nassar saga, despite the fact that in his telling, he stands by his track record. He did support an outside investigation, and ultimately the board didn't have the votes to get it done. He said his record with regards to standing, supporting survivors, he stands by that. But he did say that, just being on the board during that really toxic, tumultuous time is maybe the reason why I didn't get my party's nomination this time around.
It is interesting because if you look at the actual nuances of each of these issues, Dan Kelly often falls on the right side of this stuff, at least as far as the survivor groups that are so influential in this race have viewed it. But I think just by being there at all, that's sort of just, I guess, enough to kill his candidacy.
Yeah.
What about the more kind of modern MSU board issues? Your Tucker, your Gupta, and then of course the request for removal of two members over their repeated interference in the administration. You told me that Bahar Cook, Owen, was not supportive of Whitmer removing those trustees. What about the other candidates? Did they have thoughts on the kind of drama on the board right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think all four major candidates all said that they really wouldn't support the governor removing them. I think Stallworth told me he didn't really see anything criminal, or he described it as egregious in the report. He did, I think, similar to Bahar Cook, actually, he didn't like the part about Vassar and Deno manipulating students to try and, But in general, he thinks it's unnecessary that these things can, you elected these people and they're in office is kind of what the message that he was coming across. And Mike Belo was I think even more adamant about that. He disagrees with kind of some of the findings in the report, or at least how the report was conducted that led to this whole thing. I mean, he told me that he thought it was interesting after another trustee, Brianna Scott, released a letter which started this whole thing calling for Vassar's removal, that suddenly after this letter, all of these political leaders, were calling for her resignation. He felt like it was kind of, planned in some way, or kind of an effort to remove her because of her Nasser survivor advocacy. And so he doesn't support it either. I mean, he thinks that...
And he's been vocal about that. I mean, he's come to board meetings, he's talked about it. What about Julie Madej? Owen, did you talk to her about this?
Yeah, Julie Madej is similarly not supportive of them being removed, and she sort of sees all of this as a symptom of this larger toxicity on the board. And she talked about, it seems like everyone's always trying to backstab everyone. And she told me, it's like always someone's just trying to find a way to get someone else. She sees it as this sort of toxic thing. And she said, if everyone could act like adults, it never would have even gotten to that point where the governor had to be involved. But she also, added that she really hasn't followed it that closely, and said that there's a possibility that there's something in there that she's missed that was egregious. And so, it didn't get the impression that she's, followed the saga all that closely, but generally doesn't believe that it should have ever gotten to Governor Whitmer.
Yeah. And I think, with me, that's a similar theme with, I think, everybody except for maybe Mike Balow, is that they haven't totally followed this fully. I think Stallworth told me he hasn't read the report that started all of this.
He didn't read the Miller-Chevalier report?
No, he didn't. I mean, he's read the media reports about the report, but he he hasn't read the real thing. Yeah.
I'll say Bahar Cook seemed very, when I asked her, seemed prepared for the question, seemed to have set thoughts. Again, the most salient thing for her was sort of the manipulating students piece, but it seemed that she had been following.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. I mean, this is so much work that you guys have done, talking to all these candidates and then trying to distill it into both your stories and this appearance today. I hope this is helpful for listeners of the 1909 who are going to cast their ballot to really make an informed decision on what can seem like an insignificant race, but here at MSU, has some big effects. So yeah, that's all for now, but we'll be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. All the stories that we discussed, your profiles, the voter guide, people can find at statenews.com. Thank you to my guests, Theo and Owen, for coming on, our amazing podcast coordinator, Taylor, and most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.